Welcome to Sisters in Crime's Murder Monday, where authors talk about their crime craft. I'm Carmel Shute. I'm the Secretary of Sisters in Crime Australia, and Sisters in Crime has been celebrating women's crime writing since 1991. Today, I'm replacing Karina Kilmore, our usual interviewer. Now, before I go on to introduce our guest, Melbourne author Anna Snoekstra, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. Now, and it's 5 years since we've had the pleasure of speaking to you at an official Sisters in Crime event. Back then you were talking about your second...
Gosh, 5 years.
I know. Well, we have had a couple of years out in the wilderness. Back then you were talking about your second psychological thriller, Little Secrets, which followed your debut novel, Only Daughter, huge success. And then that's been followed by another 3 crime novels, The Spite Game, Mercy Point, and now Out of Breath, just out with HQ. Now, your books have been published in over 20 countries, 16 languages, and your first audio drama, This Isn't Happening, is out with Audible later this year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And your short stories have won Australian prizes, the Shadow Awards, Ditmar Awards, and the Aurealis Awards. Way to go. So it's obvious that I'll start that again. It's obvious that studying creative writing and cinema at the University of Melbourne, followed by screenwriting at RMIT University, can pay off. But along the way, of course, you've dealt with a large number of rejections and managed to keep body and soul together by working as a cheesemonger, a waitress, a Christmas elf, a nanny, receptionist, cinema attendant, and film reviewer. Now, before we start this interview, could you please give me the elevator pitch for your latest novel, Out of Breath?
Elevator pitch. All right. I don't think I've
even done this before, isn't it?
So it's basically, this is it. This is the beautiful cover. It's about a young woman, a young English woman called Jo, who does the 88-day visa program, which means that in order to extend your visa, she's come to Australia to extend her visa, her working holiday visa, for another year. She's got to do fruit picking. So she goes to do fruit picking in Broome, so remote Western Australian, kind of northern Western Australian, very remote area. And she gets involved with a group of, as she finds out, a group of freedivers who are living in this kind of off-the-grid community. So it's basically about a young woman who's really looking for a sense of belonging somewhere and finds it, but in basically the worst place she possibly could, somewhere where she really doesn't belong, and in a group that has some beautiful points, but also some kind of manipulations and bit of a sinister underbelly going on that we come to discover.
Wow, thank you. Why do you think crime is so appealing as a genre? This is my first question. I think there's so many reasons. I think that in some ways, something like the crime genre, you wouldn't think it, but it actually has a lot in common with the romance genre. I think because you always get some man.
Yeah. You always get your man, or you always find out, who did it, most of the time at least. I think that in dark times like we're living through, and we have been living through for a while, people are drawn to those kind of stories that will have a resolution. Romance, because it brings that kind of light, happy feelings, has that positive resolution. And then crime in a different way, because it lets us kind of face some of these fears, but we know that we're in safe hands, and we know that by the end, most of the time, justice will be restored. And I think that's a very comforting feeling of justice being restored.
So do you start with the plot or the character?
Actually, strangely, the setting. So for me, most of the time it's setting first. So I went to Broome I just thought it was just the most beautiful, beautiful place. But I did hear all these stories about some of the darker sides of things that go on there. So for me, it's very much setting. So it's kind of like I try and understand a setting on all the levels. And then within that setting, I think who would be here, who kind of populates this setting, rather than just kind of trying to plonk some random person down. And who's in Broome, you know, there's farmers, there's a lot of tourism, there's a lot of backpackers. And then from that, when I find my character, then that's when the plot kind of comes from there. So setting, and then character, and then plot, or kind of a bit of a mishmash of the three. But yeah, usually setting first.
So what's the hardest thing you've had to write about?
I don't want to give spoilers. So my husband did this 88-day visa program. I was living with, before we were married, I was living with him and a bunch of his kind of friends from England, and they were all going off and doing this program. And they were coming back just with these pretty terrible stories of some of the stuff that happened. So it's people who have no experience with agricultural work, and they're through this government program, they're being sent to these remote places to do some pretty hard labor. And there's a lot of exploitation that goes on in terms of very, very low wages. So, you know, people make under $1 an hour, and then very high accommodation. So, you know, $200 a week to live in like a shipping container with 6 other backpackers, things like that. And so there's that level of exploitation, but then there's also just some things that go on because they're in these remote areas. They don't know what they're doing really a lot of the time. So they're using equipment they don't know how to use. So there's those kind of accidents that happen. People who aren't used to the Australian heat. So people have died from heat exhaustion out there. And then abuse from some of either the farmers or there's like hostels that get involved that can be really negative. I spoke to a guy who he went to stay. He was I think he was Dutch. He went to stay at a farm. It seemed like a really good deal. He was going to be paid a kind of decent rate. And then when he got there, he was staying the first night. He was looking around the room, and he kept seeing these little holes and these blinking lights, and he realized there were literally cameras everywhere, all through his room, all through the bathroom as well. And he was just being monitored completely. And he was there on this station completely alone, no mobile reception, just him and this farmer who was secretly recording him. So things like that were pretty full on. I interviewed so many people who'd done the program and got told so many stories, some of them pretty horrible, some things that have gone on. So I think that was one of the hardest points of writing this book, was knowing where to draw the line between, I'm writing fiction, and knowing where to draw the line of what to include, and then what was going too far, what stories to take, which ones not to. Yeah, so it took me to some dark places. One of the things in particular, a farming accident that's in the book, is very much based on something that happened. I don't want to give too much away because it doesn't happen till halfway through, but I had to look at some pretty full-on photographs in order to write it. And even thinking about it makes me feel a bit sick, actually. But hopefully it works really well within the story. And I think that when people read the story, they'll see the links to really authentic experiences and places, and hopefully that'll come through.
So how do you dig yourself out of a plot hole?
I love that, dig yourself out. That's really cute. Dig yourself out of a plot hole. I guess it's a mixture of trying to figure out what's important and what isn't. So in terms of plot holes. So for example, I got very distracted with this farm and exactly what kind of food they were bringing in and what days the food would come and how they would prepare the food, and the refrigeration. It's a mango farm, the refrigeration of the mangoes and how long that would last, and the equipment they use and things like that, and exactly how often they'd go into town and all those kind of things. And I just didn't want a plot hole. I didn't want there to be this gap of people saying, oh, but shouldn't they be going into town once a week to get the groceries, or, you know, whatever. And then I realized I don't think it really matters in a fiction book. It's just like, you don't have, like, you know, someone going to the toilet every 4 hours. We don't need to see that. We can feel that in ourselves. So those were things I was worried about, that I realized I just kind of didn't need to be worried about when it came to writing fiction. In terms of a gaping plot hole, so in the story, how do you dig yourself out? You've got to think about how much you can stretch credulity, how much people are willing to kind of suspend their disbelief in the story, and how much they're not. So if it's just completely unbelievable and it pulls someone out of the story, then you need to look into it. Sometimes I find it's me being lazy. So I want something there, I really want it in the story, but I haven't earned it. And so if it's a plot hole, I'll have to go back and then really start nutting out, you know, kind of beat by beat, how we get to that point. And then if it's really should be there at all, sometimes you need to kill your darlings and take them out, which is so sad.
Do women write different crime stories to men?
I've got a confession. I rarely read crime novels by men, very rarely. I'd say probably 99% of the crime novels I read are written by women. So I don't know if I know, but I think that there's elements of reclaiming violence and reclaiming kind of gendered fear that happens when women write crime specifically. I think that women are taught to feel fear, you know, walking down the street at nighttime, you know, fear for our safety in a different way to men. And I know that I've in the past kind of internalized that feeling of being a potential victim, and that can be a really dangerous, pretty nasty experience. So I think that, as well as actual experiences of being victimized. And so I think that when women write crime fiction, there's something quite radical in it, and something quite brave, and yeah, reclaiming that violence and being the ones that get to call the shots, that get to write the story and write the ending. I think it's just a different act than when men write crime fiction. Yeah.
So what's your writing routine?
So I have had a baby about 10 months ago. And thank you. And so she has very much changed my writing routine. I didn't think she would. People said, oh, you won't be able to write anymore when you have a baby. And I was like, no, I'm going to have one of those really relaxed babies who has really long naps and just lets me write, and it's not going to be a big deal. Turns out it is hard. People were right. Everyone was right. So it used to be, during the lockdown, actually, I was getting up every morning at 6:30 and writing for 2 hours. And that's the best writing I've done, and the most excited I've found writing. I think because your brain is kind of still just slightly still asleep, slightly still linked into that kind of subconscious. And I think that being able to tell a story, being able to write in a really deep way within scenes, telling a story, you have to be able to kind of dip into that subconscious. And so I found that worked really well. So when you're turning off that analytical part of your brain that's saying, oh, this isn't good enough, or is this, you know, working? Does this, you know, service the plot, and you're just being in that moment with the characters, with the story, because part of your brain hasn't woken up enough to critique everything you're doing. I found that amazing. I wrote so much. Now, because I'm not sleeping, I can barely form a sentence at 6:30 in the morning. So now my writing routine is really about just kind of snatching those moments when they come. So during naps, during commutes, things like that, every chance I get, if I sit down. And again, I think because, you know, I'm breastfeeding, I'm, you know, changing diapers, that kind of stuff, and my brain is still ticking with the story. So now when I do get to sit down, there's no messing around. There's no, going on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. It's just very much straight in, quite intense. And I'm interested to see if that changes the style a little bit, because I found with this book, Out of Breath, the second half of it, I wrote mostly on an iPad with one of those little miniature keyboards that connects. I was really busy at the time. And so I was just writing every chance I could. And I feel like it really changed the style. It kind of, and in a way that I really loved. So it's when she arrives at this community and she's free diving, and that really affects your brain in some ways because you're depriving oxygen to your brain. And the style starts kind of getting a little bit more frenetic, a little bit more kind of staccato. And I think that it's partly just because I was using this tiny little miniature keyboard and, only had these tiny little moments of time. So it was much more fragmented. But I think that it comes through in a really interesting way in the book and kind of works. And I'm thinking now that, having had the baby and being really sleep deprived and writing, I'll have an hour and I'll just write so intensely and be so consumed by it. It'll be interesting looking back and seeing if that changes the style as well. I'm not sure if it will, but I think it definitely has in the past. So we'll see.
So what's your top self-editing process or tip for?
Yeah, I think that self-editing is so interesting. I think that it's really important not to edit at all when you're writing, to really try and turn that part of your brain off. I think especially when you're writing crime, genre writing, there is this idea that you write more often. You don't have to, but a lot of genre writers, they'll release a book every year or every few years, and that's a hard thing to do. It's really hard to be able to write a lot if you're editing as you write. So what I try and do is I try and give myself permission for that first draft to be really crap. I tell myself, just, write, I want you to write 1,000 really crap words today. And that'll just give me myself permission not to self-edit and just let it be as crap as possible. And sometimes from that, you can find some really interesting things when you let go completely and just kind of embrace it being really rough. I think that roughness can be really beautiful. So that's what I do to begin with. And then when I finish the draft, I try and give it a month. Sometimes I'm so excited I can't help it, but I try and give it a month. And then I'll go back and try and have a really fresh read, try and read it as a reader, see what's working, see what's not working. Usually there's a lot that's not working. I then apply screenwriting techniques to my edit. So I'll really try and sit back, and I'm not interested in the grammar or the line level stuff. I'm sure, the whole thing is just riddled with mistakes, but really sitting back and structurally seeing, is this working? So I'm a big fan of the 8 sequence structure. If people Google it, it'll come straight up, which is kind of a more in-depth structural tool than, there's the 3-act structure, but this is breaking it down to 8 sequences. And so I'll look at the 8 sequence structure, and then I'll apply my novel kind of through that lens, and I'll see if it fits. And if it doesn't fit, sometimes there's something missing from my book. So I'll very much look structurally first. I'll then bring up a board. I've got a few here. I'll show you, one second. So, this is one for Out of Breath. So I'll map out the chapters, do the little cards, try and be able to see it. Because I think when you're self-editing, because you're in the story, you've written the story, it's really hard to get a sense of whether what the story really is, because you've still got in your head the story that you thought you were going to write. And sometimes the story you thought you were going to write isn't the same as the story you end up writing. So it's really helpful to just literally be able to sit back and see your story. So I'll do that. So I try and do a lot of things to kind of pull away from it. And then I'll go and dive back in and let myself get back into that document, do the big structural edits first, and then go and like play around and move things around and see how it works on a more in-depth kind of scene level. So yeah, that's how I self-edit.
So who are your writing inspirations?
Writing inspirations are so many. I'm a big fan of Tana French, the Irish novelist, but I like to read, so she writes amazing Irish crime fiction. I'm sure most people in Sisters in Crime would have heard of her or have read all her books. But I like to read really diversely. So I read a lot of literary fiction. I read young adult, less so science fiction, fantasy, that's just its own world. But, you know, romance, I try and read a little bit of everything to really, I don't know, just to think a bit more broadly than just crime. But yeah, so Tana French, in terms of crime, I think she's amazing. I'm reading Jodie McAllister's book right now, Here for the Right Reasons, which is fantastic. Eliza Henry Jones, I think, is a fantastic Australian writer. And I think that her writing is just so beautiful, the way she writes about setting and place. I think that really shines through. And as we know, as crime writers, setting and place is so, so important. So I really try and look to my peers, as well as, you know, bigger authors like Tana French, or, you know, I read Stephen King, that kind of thing. I try and look more outward to my peers. Laura Elizabeth Willett, people like that. So people in Australia, mostly in Melbourne or Victoria, who are writing now for inspiration. So I mostly read Australian novels when I can. Every so often, it's, you know, a little bit of Irish or English or American, but yeah, I'd say largely books by women and largely books by Australian women.
And finally, the last question.
Ooh.
How would you get away with murder?
Oh, okay. I don't want to say I've thought about this, but I have. There's so many ways, I guess. So there's a few things that I've picked up from my reading. So one is if you've been seen, or you think you might be seen, if it's a premeditated murder, I guess that's the thing. Is it premeditated, or is it a crime of passion? If I was to commit a premeditated murder, you try and make yourself more visible rather than less visible, but in a false way. So, you know, you wear like a pink wig, and then all anyone's going to notice is that pink wig and nothing else. But if I was to walk around the way I look now, people might, you know, notice my hair, or notice, you know, my eyes or my age. But if you've got something really bold that's not actually part of your physicality, then they're more likely to notice that. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. Or, you know, black out one of your teeth, or put on an eye patch or something like that. So that's for my my premeditated murder. For my crime of passion, hide the murder weapon in plain sight. I think it's really important. And I think the big one is just don't tell anyone. I think that's how a lot of people get caught. And I think I'd find that really, really difficult not to tell anyone, because I like to talk a lot and share everything with everyone. But yeah, just if you can, trying to keep it to yourself. Don't tell anyone. And
well, thank you.
That's how people don't get caught.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we hope Out of Breath sells a mozza here and overseas. Murder Monday interviews are available on Sisters in Crime's YouTube channel mid-month. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.